We continue with Good Vibrations, a Beach Boys program. Ron Vaccaro with David Beard, the editor-in-chief of Endless Summer Quarterly, ESQ. We're beginning our dive into part one of Brian Wilson Productions. David, how do you pick the cover?
I don't know at what point it occurred to me once I knew that I was going to, this started with the news in early 2024, I think it was around February or March, about the Fred Vale's Cows in the Pasture project that film, I guess there's like a film and this album project, and that Brian is the executive producer, and it was covered by Rolling Stone, and I thought, well, I remember I have something with Fred about this, a record from 2010. And about the same time, I had gone back to the spring 2011 edition of ESQ, which featured interviews with Sharon Marie and Vicky Coker, who's now Victoria Hale. So if I say Victoria, I'm referring to Vicky Coker, who was Vicky of Bob and Vicky. And I took those interviews and I reviewed them, and I thought there was a lot. I thought Andrew Doe's interview with Sharon Marie was really, for lack of a better word, robust. I thought I had a lot of information in there. I thought he did a great job with all the follow-up questions that he had for her. And when I looked at Victoria's interview, I really felt that there was a lot of space to go in and ask more questions. And so I got both of those interviews because I went back to grab them because I thought to myself, based on the Cows in the Pasture piece in Rolling Stone, I thought I should do something like a Brian Wilson production, because it occurred to me, even though there have been projects like pet projects, this Brian Wilson CD from 2003, no one has, and I don't understand, not that there's not some information in the liner notes, which there are, and there was a Capitol box called the Capitol Years, I think it was, where one of the LPs was Brian Wilson Rarities, and Peter Ream did the liner notes for that. But I started kind of pulling these things, as I'm prone to do, and looking at them and thinking to myself, from a foundational standpoint, what do I have to work with here? I'm always asking myself, what else can I do with Endless Summer Quarterly? And the root of that question comes from what haven't I not covered? You know, in the spring 2011 issue of ESQ that included the interviews with Sharon and Victoria, Mikelove was on the cover because that's when Al, Bruce, and Mike reunited for the Ronald Reagan Centennial. So that ended up kind of being the cover, and then I had a banner going across the bottom that said Brian Wilson Productions, and I thought I want to do a legit full issue devoted to Brian and his productions. And it surprised me because then I would Google, or I'd go to YouTube to look for specific songs that I know that he produced with Gary Usher or whomever. And there's a lot of stuff out there, but there's no background to it. There's very little, and that surprised me with the day and age that we live in. There's just so much, and there's still so much unanswered. But I grabbed Sharon's interview, I grabbed Victoria's interview, I got the content that I had with Fred. Now, Cows in the Pasture is a 1970-ish album. So I said, okay, that's 1970. I've got an archival interview with Glenn Campbell from 2003 where he talks about Guess I'm Dumb. That's a Brian Wilson, that's 65. So I thought, okay, it's okay. I was thinking, is that it? And then I discovered that Dave Nolan of The Survivors was still alive and well, and reached out to him, got a great interview with him. And The Survivors, for those who don't know, were essentially Bob Norberg, Dave Nolan, Rich Illyrian, and Brian Wilson. And Brian wasn't really a survivor in quote per se. He wasn't, I don't think he was an actual member, but he was for all intents and purposes. I mean, he produced, he wrote, he arranged the things for, and sang on it with them, which is why people for years mistakenly thought that Pamela Jean was actually the Beach Boys, and it's not. It's the guy. It's Dave, Rich, Bob, and Brian. And while I'm thinking of it, I encourage everyone who's watching this to, once you're done, type in Witch Stand, and there's an AI recording of it on Day Lim's channel. Day Lims is DAELIMS, which is smile ad spelled backwards. And he does a bunch of AI generated songs, and he did the Witch Stand, which was the first Survivor song that was taken in. A master was taken in. No one knows what happened to that master. No one seems to have it or possess it. Dave Nolan would re-record it years later. And somehow this guy has put together a wonderful idea. Dave Nolan heard it and he pointed it out to me. I said, yeah, I'm well aware of it. So it turned, if Dave Nolan likes it and he was a survivor, then, I highly recommend people check it out. So yeah, I had this content, and I even had content with Dean Torrance, with Jan and Dean, talking about Surf City, which is what Brian, a significant turning point in Brian's musical career. Because Brian's productions outside of the Beach Boys, 62, 63, 64, didn't really, with the exception of Surf City and the things that he did with Jan and Dean, didn't really do anything on the charts. Now, I don't know if that was his goal. I don't know how much he cared about that. I think he was still, well, I guess we'll get into that in a minute. But so that's kind of where the idea was born. And I found I had a lot of content. And then I found Dave Nolan, got in touch with him, did that interview. And I found Cheryl Pomeroy, and I hope I say her last name correctly, Stanke. And she was Brian's first, outside of Rachel and the Revolvers, which is just prior to Bob and Sherry, Bob being Bob Norberg. So Bob and Vicky, Bob and Sherry is Bob Norberg. And the Survivors all are Bob Norberg. And Bob and Bobby is Bob Norberg. So it's, again, it's like thinking, finding maybe a little chest that, maybe a grandparent left behind in their will for you. And you're like, oh, what is in here? It's like a little treasure trove, and you open it up and you find all these cool things. But then you find something so cool, you're like wondering that you feel like you got answered. Something was answered, but by getting the one thing answered, 5 more questions pop up.
Dave Nolan, you talk with him, you interviewed him, it's included in here. But he was also, I'm going to take a quick, it's because it's in this issue as well. He was at the dinner in Hollywood recently in September with Brian and friends. And one of my, I think I told you this and you laughed at me, but one of my favorite pages in the magazine issue is just the picture of the menu from that dinner for Brian. You talk about a treasure chest. It's just like, it's that one image just takes you to the room. And I think that's one of the, we use the term in the TV business a lot, like surprise and delight. And I will say, like, if you are a subscriber to ESQ, no matter, what you're getting. If you're subscribing to ESQ, you want to deep dive on the Beach Boys, but there is still a ton of surprise and delight. You're reading the pages, you're in the news section, and then, oh wow, what's this menu staring you in the face? I just, again, I love the fact that it's something that we're going back to a very formative early period in this magazine. And yet you've got someone you did an interview with who was at the dinner with Brian in mid-September of this year. And oh, by the way, there's something from that in here as well. That connective tissue, that context is just really neat. There it is. There's the menu from Musso and Frank Grill.
Yeah, Musso and Frank's Grill. I've only been there once. And it holds, it's a dear, it's kind of, I have a really soft spot for it because, number one, it's one of the few remaining places they haven't knocked down yet, thank God. But I had dinner there, I was treated to dinner there in 2005 by Van Dyke Parks. He regaled my friends and I. I saw Mickey Rooney over in the Chapman booth, the Charlie Chaplin booth, which is over in the corner, but that's a special place. So when I saw this, and I thought it was a beautiful connector to past and present, that I actually had the interview with the guy who, and Dave has been doing this now 2 years consecutively. Last year we had a photo of he and Brian where he went and spent the day. Melinda, Brian's late wife, helped set that up so that Dave could go and see Brian, and he got to spend the day. And Dave's, and that was a news thing then too. And his message then at that time was, don't let your friendships go by without getting in contact with your friends, seeing your friends, and telling them you love them. And so, yeah, that element of my appreciation for Dave as a human being was very easy for Dave and I to connect and kind of get on and get a really nice interview out of Dave, because he's really a really grounded guy.
From putting this issue together, you, as you've just talked about, you bring a lot of knowledge to your quest, but then you gain a lot of knowledge as a result of the quest. So the question, I think, first and foremost to me is you're doing a deep dive on a formative period for Brian Wilson. Was there's specific examples of things that were moments or things that people noticed, or how much he loved being at the piano, and you could just tell, like, what, you can go on and on with some of the details, but is there something to you from the different conversations you had that if you had to put it in a nutshell, that happened during this time that helped give you further light on the period that was to follow?
There were a number of moments that informed me, that I saw as moments, significant, markers and moments for Brian that informed him. And that was hearing in these different interviews with the girls, with Vicky and Cheryl, how they both referenced Brian's love of R&B. And on one hand, I think, well, of course he liked R&B. His younger brother was playing Chuck Berry style guitars. Mike and Brian were both heavily, and I'm sure as all the guys were to some degree or another, into doo-wop. The songs that were on the radio in the late 50s going into early 60s were mostly black recording acts, with the exception of Elvis, who sounded black, right? There was a lot of successful recording acts from Motown, and that remained true going into the 60s. And so that was the thing that stood out to me, though, when I listened to, and I just want to say, any song that I mention, you're going to be hard-pressed not to be able to find it on YouTube. Okay? So I'm going to say a song title or something, and you go, what song is that? You can probably find it on YouTube on someone's channel. The Revolution, number one by Rachel and the Revolvers, is sung by a female black recording artist that Gary Usher and Brian were able to find and use. They tried a different couple of people out, and they landed with her. And so that information's in here. And it found it interesting when I started looking at this, because that was like the first, to my knowledge, maybe there was another one, but that to me was like the first. It's like October of '62, I think, or maybe even around that time. And then Bob and Sherry were right behind that, right after that. And so what stood out to me was, I thought, this is like nothing like Beach Boys music, nothing even really like the Honeys music, nothing even really kind of like Sharon Marie. And Sharon Marie's the crossover. She is kind of where you do hear Brian and Mike, because they're the ones who wrote the songs for her. Mike and Brian wrote those songs together, and they're both credited on their original singles, so this isn't something that Murray got into, thankfully. But Murray's, all three girls, everybody talked about Murray being in the studio trying to make him sound younger, which was not surprising to me. But when you look at what the records that came out for these different artists, and whether it be Bob, Sherry, Bob and Vicky, Rachel and the Revolution, or Sharon Marie, and even the Honeys to a degree. But he changed with the Honeys because Ginger Blake had the most soulful voice. So it's surprising to me to a degree that he didn't use Ginger as a lead vocalist more. Because up to the Honeys, Brian was really searching a rhythm and blues platform, musical platform with these other acts. And it never really occurred to me or stood out to me because I've got the Big Beat 1963, which is available digitally on all streaming services. Check it out. I'm just going to show you. It's the Big Beat 1963. It's a Brian Wilson. It's digitally available only, but it's available everywhere. So check it out. It's got the Summer Moon, I think, the acetate of that, which is the Bob and Vicky recording, and that was after Bob and Sherry. But you're going to hear this. And then that was the Surfer Moon, which ended up on the Beach Boys album. But there is a legitimate leakage and love of rhythm and blues from Brian Wilson that he only kind of hints at, and he doesn't really let it become a Beach Boys thing until Wild Honey. Before that, it's kind of a hidden, it might show up here or there, maybe in a jazz feel, or maybe you'll get a doo-wop feel or something. But when you had those voices, the Beach Boys voices to work with and such, it really, that's the biggest question mark is, would Brian have pursued a production career had these records been successful? So and when we get to the Sharon Marie part and the next, once we talk about whatever else you want to talk about in the first one, once we get to part two, we'll get a little bit more into that. What else did you want to ask me about part one?
Well, you just answered one of my questions preemptively, I think, based on the way you phrased that. But I was going to ask you if you could talk to Brian right now, and ask him one question about this period, having done all these collateral conversations, what would it be? So maybe you just answered it, or maybe that was one of the primary questions. But what's top of your mind that you'd want to ask him if you could?
Oh, absolutely. Would had these different projects that you did charted, would they have been enough of a serious consideration for you to pursue that? It's an absurd amount of music that he was creating, arranging, writing, and producing. It's absurd.
Pace was a word that came up everyone was remarking about the pace.
Yes. So, if you just let's just take these side productions outside the Beach Boys, and we're just going to put them right over here for a second. And you just look at the output of just the Beach Boys. That's an absurd pace. It's an absurd pace. 12 albums in 4 years. 2 albums, 3 weeks of one another. That's crazy. I think it was Surfer Girl to Little Deuce Coupe. 3 weeks. 3 weeks apart in stores. That 3 weeks.
They were masters of binging before we knew what it was.
That's great. So now you have this absurd amount of music. Let's pull these productions back into the picture. And it's amazing. It's amazing. And I'll tell you one of the things, and this kind of goes into part two. One of the other things that I discovered that stood out to me was in '64. Brian is back touring with the group, and they released Shutdown Volume 2. Short period later, they start the All Summer Long sessions. And the All Summer Long sessions go directly. This is May, June of '64. They go directly into the Christmas album sessions. It's all happening at the same time. All Summer Long comes out. They finish the Christmas sessions. Then that record comes out in I think November after the concert album. But it's done at the same time. It's in the same doorway. And so what happens then is they do the concert, but they have to go on an Australian tour. And I looked at going by, whenever I reference something off the top of my head, anyone should know I'm referring to Andrew Doe's Bellagio website. So easiest way to find that is to go to ESQ website. It's esquarterly.com, and then click the About Us button, or About. And then Andrew Doe's face is in there. Click on that; it'll take you right to it. And go through shows and sessions. It's amazing. It's kind of a Beach Boys Bible online, and it's great. So I always kind of go to that, and then I will check it, double check some other references. But Brian was not able to record except a couple of things. The first time he worked with Glenn Campbell was October of '64. First take for Guess I'm Dumb, October of '64. He goes on the Australian tour, and it's one of the tracks for the Today album that I want to say Kiss Me Baby in the fall winter of '64. That's it. Now I'm sure he may have been writing on a legal pad or something. So I don't think he wasn't, in quote, writing, but he was not able to physically get himself into the studio. And I think this is what just came to me recently. You know, he has the, in quote, nervous breakdown or whatever you want to call it on the airplane. I think that struggle for him came from the fact that he wasn't back home. Yes, he did not want to tour, but I think the biggest thing was looking at the amount of sessions he was able to record in that period, two, and the length of since the end of July at some point all the way through to November. That must have been driving him crazy because that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to be in the studio. He wanted to work on tracks. He was growing, and I just think that pulling him away from his wheelhouse, what he wanted to do, is what I would not doubt. I don't care whatever side of the argument you're on or whatever side of the coin you're on. If he just did it to get out of touring, good for him, because that he knew he wanted out. He knew he wanted out, and he had had enough. It wasn't that he didn't like the guys or anything like that. He did not want to tour. He wanted to be in the studio. And that's the thing that stood out to me just like a week ago for the first time ever that I looked at that, because you're talking about this insane, amazing pace, and then all of a sudden two sessions. And I'm thinking, oh God, that must have been driving him crazy, because he clearly was on fire.
Before we go on to part two, I wanted to ask you a question or two about the Dean Torrens conversation that's in here. And the first is, and it's just one of those things. One of the great things about the Q&A style is you can, in the midst of a Q&A, you can see like where the question and answer, and it's not block paragraphs, but it's like, that there start to be a bit rapid fire. There's something good here with the exchange. But one of the stories that's there that it smiled when I read it was the the whole reaction to, Surfing USA asked if you could record it, the response, and then a pretty darn good consolation prize, so to speak.
Yeah. So I think there's a good one of my podcast episodes out there with Dean talks about. It was right after Chuck Berry died, and I wanted to honor Chuck some way. So I put out that interview. A chunk of what's in this edition is actually available as one of my podcast episodes too. It's a Chuck Berry tribute, and Dean talks about, that's where this interview comes from. They knew, they had done shows already. They've been around since the late 50s. They knew Chuck Berry. They had met Chuck Berry. I don't know if they knew him, but they knew his people, his publicist, his management. So it would be an easy enough thing for them to have their manager, Lou Adler, contact Chuck's people to say, hey, we've got this surfing song that we're going to do, Brian Wilson gave us, and it uses your melody from Sweet Little 16. So we just need to sign the paperwork so we can get this released, which is what Dean was trying to tell Brian. And Brian assured them that his father said it was okay. So, because Murray was in over his head. Murray did not understand the industry. He didn't understand how publishing or licensing worked. And he heard a great song, and it is a great song. It's probably one of their staples, but beyond the shadow of a doubt, Surfing USA is like a song that almost, I think, everybody knows as much as they know Kokomo or much as they know Good Vibrations or I Get Around. That is one of the top tier songs. If you play it for anybody, they just like it because it's a happy, vibrant song. And it established who they were. I mean, there is Surfin' Safari and Surfin' before that, but Surfin' Safari to me was the one that so I'm glad Brian held on to it. But to your point in the story, he says, well, I've got this other one. Well, he had two. And that's interesting. And Dean doesn't usually bring it up, but I do cover both. and one is Gonna Hustle You. And so he told him he played Gonna Hustle You, and he played Goody Connie, Won't You Come Out Tonight? And Goody Connie became Two Girls for Every Boy, and then it ultimately became Surf City. And Gonna Hustle You turned into When I Get a Chance with You, turned into New Girl in School, which would appear on their '64 album, Dead Man's Curve, New Girl in School. So they did pretty well for themselves working with Brian. Here's Brian with this great song, and it is a great song. Surfing USA is just, like I said, cement. It's one of the best. But he gives them Surf City. And had Brian not given them that, can you imagine Surfing USA and Surf City being like an A-side, B-side single? I mean, whoa. I mean, that would have really been something. And it would have sounded, not to take anything away from Jan and Dean, it would have sounded better with a four vocals on it versus Jan and Dean being doubled. So it would have been, that would be something really interesting for that AI guy I mentioned. I would like him to make it sound like a Beach Boys record. But yeah, man, Surf City is as if anybody hears Surf City anymore, they're going to assume it's a Beach Boys song. If they hear that it's by someone named Jan and Dean, they're not going to have any idea who Jan and Dean are. So it might as well be a recording by the Beach Boys, because it's exactly in the same vernacular. It is the genre. It is, and it tells you how special that period was for pop radio, AM radio, and how special Brian Wilson was as a writer and producer, because it's good stuff.
I think last thing, from me from this part one, just I'll share like my favorite perhaps nugget in there that I was like, it was the conversation where it's revealed that Brian was in, and maybe this is odd, but like to me, a lot of this is discovery. That Brian hated hearing his falsetto voice and didn't like to sing it and didn't like to use it, and it's just like, could you imagine? Like, thank God he got over that, and and the steps that are like, like, my gosh, could you imagine if that had stayed? Because wow, did it,
he
change the world.
Yeah, it did, and he got a little bit more self-conscious about it as time went on. He was still kind of self-conscious. Is it Girl, Let Him Run Wild? Brian was never really crazy about his falsetto on that. He talked about that when I saw him in '98 in Nashville at Masterphonic Studio, when he was recording. He was re-recording that song, and for his Imagination album. And he was talking about how the falsetto bothered him, and I, because he thought he sounded too much like a girl. But my gosh, that's what makes those songs signature. It's a signature, It's the blend, and then the falsetto comes out like a flower in bloom. Especially Lonely Sea. Every time I think of the song Lonely Sea, I'm that is such I think of that as a quintessential early Beach Boys recording as much as I do Surfing USA. Lonely Sea is a significant moment for me as a fan of the records.
Well, that covers part one, unless there's anything you want to say as a parting shot before we move on to part two of the dive into Brian Wilson Productions.
No, I think we've touched on enough. There's so many little nuggets, as you say, and goodies and things like that are in this issue that I love talking about this stuff, but there's so many cool things in here that if I were to, then I'd almost be ruining a surprise. And I don't want to do that.